I'm going to do a reading today from the book Light from the Darkness, which was discussed in the latest episode of Speaking of Jung, episode 150, with Peter's daughter, who happens to be a Jungian analyst. Her name is Eva Wertenschlag-Birkhäuser. And in honor of Marie-Louise von Franz, I am wearing my t-shirt with her image on it, which was designed by the artist and art professor Timothy Hall, who was my guest in episode 50. He is a listener of the show and he is a brilliant artist. He's designed these t-shirts and he created an Etsy store, and I'll provide a link to that in the description box below. So today I want to do a reading from Light from the Darkness because there is an essay by Peter Birkhäuser himself in this book that I don't think I mentioned during the episode with Eva. I reread it just this week and I thought I would really like to read this on our YouTube channel, because when the book Jung's Last Lectures, or The Last Lectures of C.G. Jung, came out, I read a chapter. Something caught my eye and I wanted to share it with all of you. So I read it and it's here on the YouTube channel. I'm wearing a NASA sweatshirt. And I thought that I would like to do more of these since I'm only producing one episode of Speaking of Jung per month. I'd like to do more book readings because a lot of the material does not make it into the show. I do provide all of my research notes to our Patreon members. You can join our Patreon for $5 a month. And once a month, you will receive all of the notes that I use to prepare. There are a lot of book quotes because I pull quotes from what I'm reading to save them, to post them on social media, to maybe include them in the episode. But most of what I put together does not make it into the episode. I have it on my computer. I would love to share it with all of you. So that is our Patreon perk. For $5 a month, you receive pages and pages and pages of the notes that I compile while preparing for an episode. So this book, Light from the Darkness, contains Peter Birkhäuser's paintings, and then you can't see, and then commentaries by Marie-Louise von Franz, as well as some essays. And it was republished. This is the painting that's on the cover of Eva's book, Windows on Eternity. The new edition by Diamond, which you see on the screen, includes additional paintings and expanded commentaries, more essays. This was discussed on the episode that we just did at length. So this book is currently 14% off on Amazon US. You can also get it on Amazon Germany, which is amazon.de, and it's available from Diamond Furlog's US distributor, Baker and Taylor. You can also get it on Bookshop. It's probably available on Abe Books. So it's out there. Years ago, Gary Sparks first told me about this book when I went to visit him at his home to record episode 2. And he told me about this book. He showed it to me and I had a really hard time getting a copy, and I finally did. But this is the original edition that was published in 1981. And yes, you've heard me speak about this painting, The Observer, many times on this show. I saw the original. I think this is a draft. This is not the finished product, which is in color. I saw the original of this painting at the Psychology Club in Zurich. It's hanging in the lecture hall. So this is actually the back of the book. But the new edition by Diamond, which I have as an ebook because it's a review copy so that I could present the interior during the episode. I have it here. Actually, I'm going to add this and show you the table of contents. So there's a foreword to the new edition, which was written by Eva and her brother, Casper. And there is an introduction by Eva. The plates with commentaries by von Franz are all of the artworks that are reproduced in full color on art paper. Gorgeous, really beautiful. I mean, there are so few publishers that go to these lengths to produce quality books anymore these days, and Diamond Verlag does. Their books are a little bit more expensive than you're probably used to. For instance, Reflections on the Life and Dreams of C.G. Jung, which we did an episode about a few years ago, actually in 2023. This is only available in hardcover for good reason. Even the cover is beautiful and on really high quality paper. There are photos in this book, and I didn't show any photos. There are photos in this book, lots of them, and it costs money to publish photos in books. And they're historical photos, Jung, Yaffe, really, really beautiful book. And it's a great reference book, research book. Looks great on a bookshelf. So I highly recommend this book, which is all of the material that didn't wind up in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. So there are additional chapters on things that Jung said that didn't make it in MDR. So published here for the first time, and photos that had never been published before as well. So his thoughts on life after death, for instance, are in here, and reincarnation. I wanted to focus on light from the darkness today. And that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to read Peter Birkhäuser's essay now from this book. It's titled Analytical Psychology and the Problems of Art. Jung's discovery of suprapersonal, spontaneous spiritual activity in the unconscious has changed the way we need to see everything, even if outwardly this change is barely noticeable at the present time. As a result, Jung had enriched the most diverse fields of human intellectual and scientific endeavor, and it is still impossible to predict where and how far this innovation will lead in the future. In any event, it has shed new light on the problems of art. Indeed, I believe that Jung may have shown us the way leading out of the confusion in which art has lost its way. Originally, figurative representation was a magic art, a charm to exorcise evil spirits, or a means to make the gods appear in visible form, a kind of religious ritual. It was a way of seeking healing and protection. For instance, in Egyptian and classical antiquity, in the Eastern civilizations, art was chiefly a religious instrument, and this was true as well in the Christian Middle Ages. As individuals, artists remained anonymous. There should be a comma there. As individuals, artists remained anonymous. They were expected to stay in the background and accomplish most of their tasks along strictly prescribed and doctrinally predetermined lines. The art of the Renaissance began to move away from this introverted attitude in which the inner image was the essential thing. It abandoned this previous source of inspiration, and as part of the general intellectual movement of the time, it became extroverted. For many people, the world of Christian ideas had lost its attraction and no longer provided adequate possibilities for expression. The new Western zeitgeist was outward-looking and fascinated by the secrets of nature, which had been ignored for so long. In art, too, attention began to focus on the rich panoply of external appearances. In those days, for instance, many artists were also scientists. One Renaissance paper wrote that he went to bed each night happy in the knowledge that the next day he would be permitted to study the divine perspective. Leonardo da Vinci excelled not only as a great artist, but also as an anatomist, mathematician, and engineer. And Michelangelo was so fascinated by the structure of the human body that he devoted many years to its study. Although paintings and statues for churches still form the bulk of art produced at that time, the sacred images increasingly resembled attractive studies from nature. The human body with the play of muscles and the way it was posed in space. Textile drapery, animals, plants, and background landscapes became ever more important. At the same time, the original content, i.e., the Christian mythos, began to recede in the background. In their enthusiasm for pagan appreciation of the world, artists began to represent the gods of antiquity and their legends instead of their own. Soon afterwards, the Reformation was to batter a huge breach in the defenses of dogmatic Christian traditions, giving it literal expression in the onslaught of the iconoclasts. Interesting. In his Bailey Island seminar, Jung said the Catholic Church is a way of living the unconscious, and the dogmas of the Catholic Church contain all the history of the unconscious objectified. Whatever they represent as happening is what happens in the unconscious, unquote. Footnote 1, C.G. Jung, Dream Symbols of the Individuation Process, seminar held at Bailey Island, Maine, 1936, private print. New. Suzanne Geiser, editor, Philemon Foundation, Series 15, Princeton and Woodstock, Princeton University Press, 2019, page 125. As people increasingly departed from this inner world of images in the 16th century, there arose a covert countercurrent, the symbolic fantasies of the alchemists. Jung discussed this in his Zarathustra seminar, and he described the unbearable tensions caused by the loss of the sacraments of confession and absolution. For this reason, he said, the wise old man came to the alchemists, here a personification of the unconscious, advising them to solve their problems through an inner priesthood with the use of images, but the alchemists' introverted search and groping for a continued development of mythical conceptions found little resonance, apart from, for example, in Grunwald, Bosch, or Dürer. The sensitive barometer of art clearly indicates how the passion for representing the outer world continued to grow during the 16th and 17th centuries. There was no getting enough of the charms of the senses. The techniques of shading were added to perspective. In other words, artists learned how to further emphasize spatiality and the curves of bodies through artful lighting and the principles of falling shadows. Anatomical features became fleshly, as with Rubens, and the sensuous pleasure in everything external can be seen in countless beautiful still lifes of venison, set tables, fruit, fish, flowers, musical instruments, and so on. Some painters even specialize in portraying farmyard poultry. Motifs included domestic, society, and military scenes, and portraiture played an increasingly important role. Subjects for artists also extended beyond the immediate surroundings of individuals to townscapes, seascapes, or landscapes in the different seasons. The inner landscape, on the other hand, was increasingly lost from view. If the inner world was portrayed at all, it was in the form of traditional, emotionless church art, in which the symbolism was in danger of being stifled by excessive materiality or sought refuge in the alien context of classical mythology. The movement away from symbolic motifs and towards light can even be seen in a highly introverted and religious artist like Rembrandt. Whereas in the 17th century, the approach was still serious, weighty, at times naive, what had started as a passionate attention to outer surfaces became superficiality in the 18th century. Elegance, refinement, and sophisticated craftsmanship produced beautiful portraits, landscapes, and the like, but the altar paintings of the time reveal how alienated they had become from their mythological sources. The virgins are nothing more than saucy ladies, and the angels have all turned into cupids. True religious fervor of the kind expressed in the Gothic altar paintings is nowhere to be found because the energy of the images coming from the unconscious is lacking. Huge point there. People in those days had largely lost touch with their inner being. A one-sidedly rational attitude predominated, and with it a psychic rift and dissension that burst out in the French Revolution. The revolution swept away a lot that was outdated and life-destroying, but it also led to the overestimation of human reason. In 1793, the Des Raisons replaced the Virgin Mary in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. In a fateful development, the cult of reason was introduced. Soon after that, Shelley, with considerable perspicacity, wrote that cultivation of the natural sciences, which had given humans mastery over the external world, demanded a corresponding expansion of the inner world to prevent the human race, which had made slaves of the elements, from becoming slaves themselves. The Swiss artist Fuseli, too, painted a prophetic vision of the psychic state of the age. It portrays a sleeping woman extended in an excruciating posture with the nightmare imp pressing down on her chest. The huge, wild head of a blind mare can be seen behind her bed. The painting intimates that the mind, in the absence of the conscious faculties, is tormented by evil dreams and threatened by the blind frenzy of the unconscious. Prints of the paintings were distributed widely in the years after the Revolution, but it was so poorly understood that it was sold in France accompanied by an obscene poem. The Revolution ended in a bloodbath and the megalomania of Napoleon. A relationship with the psyche was further away than ever. It was a time of rather stagey art, a bloodless imitation of antiquity. David, a Jacobin painter and something of a propaganda minister for the revolutionary government, even wanted to force everyone to dress like ancient Romans. David wrote to a pupil he was encouraging to paint Vita Vita, something I can't pronounce in French. Foulettes votre Plutarque. He was being urged to read the classics to find his subjects. An opposing current began to flow in art during the German Romantic movement, but it was too weak and it lacked the necessary armory to overcome the materialistic bias against the spiritual. For example, the Nazarene school took refuge in regressing into a kind of monastic existence by trying to imitate the piety and inwardness of the Middle Ages. They painted altarpieces in the style of the 15th century, an attempt that was, of course, doomed to failure. The single most daring and thoroughly positive attempt to find a way beyond the growth of rationalism is the magnificent landscapes of Caspar David Friedrich, in which he sought to represent the divine in nature. But he remained alone and misunderstood. When he died in 1840, art had on the whole become petrified in photographic imitation of the external world and in lifeless copies of former styles. Goethe's Faust fantasy rears up like an isolated mountain range above the flat rationalism of his epic. When he was asked reproachfully how on earth it was to be understood, he answered, "The more a poetic creation is incongruous and inaccessible to reason, the better it is." In the light of the general attitude of utilitarianism and the one-sided preponderance of rationalism, the irrational found fewer and fewer outlets for expression, as even the religious forms had no life left in them. The soul remained banished to the underworld. However, since the powers of the unconscious could not be magicked away, they began to undermine the walls of reason from within. In art, a reaction set in against the still predominant ideals of the Renaissance, which had become tired and lifeless. Around 1860, the Impressionists made their appearance. Impressionism is an inaccurate label which happened to be taken up because one of the paintings in an exhibition was titled, quote, Impression, unquote. They themselves used the name divisionists because they divided up the phenomena of the visible world into their separate color components. One group of divisionists even called themselves pointillists because they used a matrix of colored dots to create an image. The Impressionists emphasized their lack of interest in the content of paintings. They were far more concerned with the limited province of color. This process of dismemberment went further with the advent of Cubism at the turn of the 20th century, breaking down the forms of exterior phenomena into their basic geometrical elements. From there, it was only a short step to abstract art, which renounced portrayal of both outer and inner objects. So by approximately the time of the First World War, the integral ideal representation of the outer world along traditional lines had disintegrated. This is fascinating. This guy gets no coverage. Please don't troll me for drinking something. You try this, okay? See how many times you drink. The outline given here naturally involves a lot of generalization and in reality, diverse currents were running side by side and overlapping. The essence of the process, according to Jung, was the devaluation of the object. Art compensates for the bias of an age. Another factor that contributed to the devaluation of an art that had become over-extroverted was the advent of photography. As an even more mechanical visual medium combined with a capacity for mass reproduction, photography dealt the death blow to a naturalist style of painting completely devoid of spiritual vitality. Now that portrayals of the external world had been devalued and dissolved, the way had become clear for a turn to the image within. Without this development, it would never have been possible for art to free itself from the antiquated Renaissance ideal. We can see this in the 19th century artists who tackled motifs from the interior world using traditional techniques like Klinger, Böcklin, or Thoma. Their paintings remained trapped in allegories, which were represented just like concrete outer reality. When the pioneers of modern art turned away from externality, it was a hopeful, promising development. But would they be able to access the world within? Was that even possible without a positive attitude to the psyche? Simply turning away from the exterior does not guarantee attention to the interior. Indeed, the unbroken supremacy of materialism, with its devaluation of all things spiritual, which had been carried over from the 19th century, was in no mood to do so. It blocked the passage to the interior world. In his Zarathustra seminar, Jung described how access to the unconscious is obstructed in the modern age, so that it forces its way to the surface and spews out inchoate lava. This kind of volcanic activity can be observed in a number of recent trends in art, like Tackism, with its portrayal of the unformed and shapeless. The violent eruption can be seen in the technique of firing a gun in a pot of paint, splattering its contents on the canvas, or pouring petrol on the painted surface and lighting it so that the fire scorches out holes and bizarre patterns. Randomly generated images like this may well have a stimulating effect on the imagination, but they will certainly not be enough on their own to express the contents of the unconscious, for the simple reason that we often experience very impressive clearly defined and entire figures in dreams and fantasies, which act out scenes and dramatic events marked by their richness and exoticism. In his dream analysis seminar, Jung said, quote, "One is impressed by the fact that the unconscious of man is a sort of mirror of great things," unquote. However, all too frequently, materialistic prejudices, cynicism, and anxiety block access to the inner world. And the most widely disseminated psychologies are incapable of seeing its hidden values, or else they consider them to be substitutes for sexuality and the like. The spirit cannot flourish under such influences. These attitudes produced a dangerous state of explosive inner tensions because the collective unconscious had no effective connection to life. There will be, quote, "a great mental upheaval," unquote, Jung predicted decades ago for this very reason. And it seems to us that this is precisely the state we have arrived at. We often hear people say that today's chaotic art is a representation of precisely this type of chaotic state. But being swamped by chaos is not the same thing as representing it. That would require detachment, a stable external conscious position from which to make a formative intervention. Besides, there is something negative about merely hanging around in a state of derangement. I believe the task is to search instead, with this amorphous mass of chaotic lava, for signs of a new order. There is already a great unspoken longing to move beyond disintegration. With the right attitude, it is possible to navigate the stream of the unconscious without losing one's own position. That is the only way to recognize and grasp what is valuable. The upsurge of psychic material must be scrutinized and selected, just as dreams would be meaningless without a conscious ego to experience them. In his Zarathustra seminar, Jung described the great peril many people find themselves in owing to the loss of religion, the loss of contact with the depths of the unconscious, as follows, quote, "That is what people don't know. They don't know that they are exposed naked to the unconscious when they can no longer use the old ways. They are defenseless and have to repress their unconscious. They cannot express it because it is inexpressible," unquote. The unconscious has become inexpressible for those who have barricaded all avenues leading to it because they are trapped in rationalism. So, there is good reason for the artists of today to seek access to the world within, to become some kind of safety valve or container to hold what is surging up from below on behalf of themselves and the rest of humanity. They need to try to harness the psychic powers in visual form, which will involve the realization that they are faced with something living and autonomous emerging from the psyche. Today's artists would thus do well to find some access to the inner world, both for themselves and for their contemporaries, to provide a valve or to be a vessel that can receive the contents of the unconscious. They should try to capture the psychic forces in pictures. This implies that they must have experienced them as being alive and spontaneous. For instance, a giant wild huntsman dressed in green, a figure resembling Odin, came to a painter in a dream, forcing his way into the studio and demanding to be painted. A clear manifestation of the spontaneous activity of figures in the unconscious, seeking out an individual in order to be seen and recorded. Another dream involved a person in an endless labyrinthine cave system. He knew something else lived there, which was looking for him, a mighty figure, half beast, half god. He was terrified of this being and ran away from it, yet was attracted by it at the same time. This was an image of the creative daemon of the unconscious, hungry for contact with the human being, pursuing him over long and twisting paths. This is the equivalent of Pollux, the immortal divine brother of Dioscuri. This is a power which can also turn into a destructive demon if it continues to be denied and excluded from life. A talented man who was, however, liable to misuse unconscious contents for selfish ends dreamed of someone who had discovered a huge ancient underground vault filled with golden honey. He forced his way in and opened the doors, letting the honey escape in such a rush that the greedy man drowned in it. Then the dreamer himself climbed down into the vault to retrieve the spoils, but was ambushed by the devil and only escaped by the skin of his teeth. This dream shows how the treasure of the unconscious can prove a bane. Its misuse may summon the devil. Damn. This dream shows how the treasure in the unconscious can prove a bane. Its misuse may summon the devil. It is really impressive to see how the unconscious reacts to these problems and responds according to each individual case. In dreams, it sheds light on situations that are frequently obscure to consciousness, at times inspiring, encouraging, supportive, at others critical, admonitory, or censorious. A woman who was about to start a creative project and needed encouragement had a dream that her garden was full of ripe golden apples. Being productive is here envisaged as harvesting something valuable that had ripened in the unconscious. Ripened in the unconscious. I love that. By contrast, someone else who was avoiding an intellectual activity dreamed that the fruit in a garden was rotting because it had not been picked. A man who was still totally unaware of his intellectual capacities dreamed that he had discovered a wonderful, exotic, richly decorated treasure chest. Indeed, a dream motif that appears regularly is the big house with unexplored rooms full of precious things. A woman who had spent a long time in analysis and then became an analyst herself had dreamed many years previously that she had found a healing spring in a subterranean cave, which required years of patient work to encase for use. Encase, E-N-C-A-S-E. Someone working on a creative writing project had made the mistake of treating a serious subject ironically. In his dream, a great female artist, a painter of mythical fantasies, had died as a result of cynical comments written about her paintings. This dream made the writer realize that the artistic woman inside him would die if his conscious mind failed to treat the images from his unconscious seriously. I'm going to read that again. This dream made the writer realize that the artistic woman inside him would die if his conscious mind failed to treat the images from his unconscious seriously. All the dream images I have just described are a clear indication of how the ego is the recipient of powerful, superior, and valuable elements which may be present in the unconscious. They also reveal that the ego requires the appropriate attitude of humility in order to gain access to these treasures, and must be willing to accept tribulations and sacrifices in the same way the hero in fairy tales has to take on an inferior role. He must sacrifice all sense of entitlement and often has to carry out difficult and dangerous tasks before obtaining the hoped-for prize. So it might well be the task imposed on the artist of today to develop a new form of expression suited to the age which does justice to the contents of the unconscious. It involves a struggle to make things visible that almost defy representation. The more seriously painters take the inner images, the greater their wish to perfect their portrayal will be. When modern art was forced to turn away from all traditions around the turn of the 20th century, it also abandoned the traditional techniques of its craft. The inheritance of what is this word? Droughtmanship, learned with much painstaking study of figurative drawing, perspective, and so on, was not a problem in itself. What had to be rejected was the way it had been abused in the naturalistic art of the 19th century. It could seem questionable to abandon all these inherited riches of knowledge and skill, and yet there was no avoiding the fact that it was the means of expression of an art which had become more and more one-sidedly extrovert, excessively scientific, in order to capture every single detail of outward appearance. What is dangerous about these classical techniques is that objects from the interior world portrayed like this could be drawn too far in a material direction and thus distorted. On the other hand, it does not seem to be a satisfactory solution to be content with the random and amorphous products of drip paint I have described as modern art either. That would be rather like accepting a found object like a quaintly twisted tree root as an adequate expression of the unconscious. Stimulating the imagination in this way is probably the basis, rather like the prima materia, from which the value must then be distilled in painstaking labor. From what I have been trying to sketch out so far, it should be clear that art today is no longer a mere matter of aesthetics. It is not an end in itself, according to the motto, art for art's sake, but should be seen as an aid to finding ways of expressing new, undiscovered psychic contents. The ego must behave in a receptive way, which requires a religious attitude. Religious in the sense of carefully observing and taking account of psychic factors. Whereas religious art in former times produced paintings of generally sanctioned and orthodox subjects, today's artists are on their own with their experiences, exposed to all types of error. In Psychology and Religion, Jung wrote, quote, "A dogma is always the result and fruit of many minds and many centuries, purified of all the oddities, shortcomings, and flaws of individual experience. But for all that, the individual experience, by its very poverty, is immediate life, the warm red blood pulsating today. It is more convincing to a seeker after truth than the best tradition," unquote. This sort of individual experience implies a return to a kind of primal condition, since it is individual visions that reveal the world within. It is a new beginning. Jung saw himself primarily as a physician, but it has become increasingly clear that he did not just treat individual patients, but became a healer of his entire age. By helping countless people to relate to the productive, guiding, and structuring side of the psyche, he provided a wider context to the problem of psychological suffering, showing that it was a result of being disconnected from one's essential being and true destiny. By pointing this out, he freed people of our time from the bleak and futile restrictiveness of a materialist worldview and gave them the opportunity to experience the workings of the mysterious powers that give individual meaning to their lives. The psychic life cannot thrive in an atmosphere of rationalism, which lies like a stone on top of a plant, smothering any idiosyncratic creative seed that tries to germinate and develop in the psyche. Jung freed it from this encumbrance. He not only gave a theoretical delineation of this spiritual urge in the unconscious, he also showed examples of how it operates and let it inform his own life. For this reason, artists today can see Jung as a role model in the search for a path to the treasure house of the soul. Speaking of that precious vessel, he gave us the beautiful and comforting words, quote, "It seems to me that nothing essential has ever been lost, because its matrix is ever present within us. And from this, it can and will be reproduced if needed," unquote. Zurich, 6th of June, 1970, on the occasion of the memorial ceremony for C.G. Jung. Again, this is the essay by Peter Birkhäuser titled Analytical Psychology and the Problems of Art. You can find it in this book. Light from the Darkness, Paintings by Peter Birkhäuser, the new edition published just this year by Diamond Verlag. Links will be in the description below.